Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your location. Once again, this is Leadership Talk with Adegoke, and I'm so excited to be sharing the platform with my friend from Melbourne, Australia, Bron Williams, and we're looking at leadership and bias. This is Leadership Talk with Adegoke, the 57th episode. Yes, 57th episode. How are you, my friend?
I am doing really, really well. It's springtime here in Melbourne. You'd never know it looking at my
Wow,
jumper. I
wow,
know.
wow.
Yes. So we're hoping it'll start to warm up a bit soon.
Wow, and that's interesting, isn't it? Because in the UK it's winter.
Yep.
Yeah, United Kingdom
We're
is
heading.
winter. We are going into the where I am in Africa right now. We're going to the Amazon season. Which is
Yep.
December. Yeah, so it's amazing. The time zones and what time is it then in Melbourne?
It's just after 4 p.m.
Oh wow, this is just access after 6 a.m. in the morning. Yeah.
Yes, but we are on the same day.
Okay. Oh, that's good. That's good.
So that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Now, you're welcome to Leadership Talk with Adegoke. Tell us, who is Bron? Who is Bron?
Well, given my grey hair, I've been around the sun a few times. So I have had a mixed bag of a life, as so many of us who get to an older age do. So, trained as a teacher, I wanted to be a teacher when I was 8 years old, and so I
Wow.
followed that path and stayed in the education profession for probably 25 or 30 years, teaching little children. I did work in preschools right through primary, elementary. Did a little bit of high school work, worked with kids with special needs, and also ended up doing some adult education and reached, in a sense, a pinnacle where I was principal of a small school for 1 year. So that was that career. Then
Wow.
midlife, as things often do, life changed and I joined the Salvation Army and became an ordained minister and had a variety of roles there, looking after a church and a welfare centre, and went to Nauru and worked with asylum seekers. And now, in the third season of my life, I'm the
Yeah.
bias specialist. So I'm working with corporates, businesses, sporting groups to talk about unconscious bias and the impact that it has, particularly on leadership and on how leaders make decisions. Because
Wow.
bias is a bit like understanding bias is a bit like the silver bullet for business.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow. Before I met you, I'd never heard about bias. I knew bias as a word, but not as in terms of a profession. So you are a
Yes.
bias specialist. Now, what is this thing about being a bias specialist?
Yeah, it's funny. I had somebody on Twitter today, I think, say a little bit cynical, oh, that sounds very important. Um, in a sense, yes, it is important. Well, at this point in life, I don't want to be doing anything that's not important because,
Yeah.
we were talking earlier before we went live about how quickly time goes. And at this point of life, I want to make the most of the remaining time, hopefully another 30 years, but who knows, that I've got. Bias is actually is important because bias is how we unconsciously privilege a group of people or a set of ideas, often to the detriment or the exclusion of other people or other sets of ideas. And it forms really early in childhood. It doesn't matter what culture we grew up in, what age we are, what gender, any of those things. All of us have biases and they impact our decision making. But even more than that, bias underlies all the discrimination and the injustice that we see in our world. So things like racism, ageism, sexism, disability discrimination, bullying and harassment all have a form of bias underneath. So if we can
Wow.
start to address that bias, then it's it's easier to address the things that we see on the surface that
Wow.
we really don't like and we want to
Wow.
change.
Wow. So you got your work cut out?
Yeah, it's I don't think I'll ever come to the end of the work. Because people ask me whether we can eliminate bias, and I say no, but we can learn to work with it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. I just want to salute you and celebrate you because that area is very, very deep. I know there are about 200 nuances, on bias. Is that correct?
Oh, look, I've seen, PDFs that have got 50 different types of biases, and we can look at it. And I think it's important to look at this area from that sort of academic or cognitive point of view. But the work that I do is much more personal. I get people to start looking at, well, where might I have a bias in my relationships, in how I view money, in my identity, how I view myself. So, because that's where bias is going to show up in a real way in everyday life, and we need to address it there.
Wow. So I just wanted to now speak to leadership and bias. What's the relationship between leadership and bias?
Well, given that all human beings are biased and have biases, leaders are going to have them as well. But because of the role that leaders play and the place of significance that they have, whether that's in a small, one or two person business right through to a large, multinational corporation, leaders are making decisions that impact other people, not just themselves. And so for leaders to become aware that they have biases and those biases predispose them to making presumptions and assumptions, and we have preconceptions about people, about options. If we start to open our minds to those possibilities, we are less likely to make decisions that are flawed or that will be hurtful to ourselves, to our businesses, and to other people.
Wow. So how can you overcome bias? For example, I'm not of your race, and Australia. I know you guys are far away. I've never been to Australia before. Probably you've never interacted with somebody of African descent. How do you overcome that bias?
Well, it's about what I've discovered, and I've discovered this at a personal level. And I think it's really important because there's no point in me talking about something that I haven't actually made a reality in my own life.
Yeah,
experienced. So what I have discovered is that when we become aware of a particular bias, it's like, when you go and if you buy a new car, I have a red car. So I see red cars everywhere. That's what awareness does for us when we become conscious of something.
Yeah.
And that's what happens with biases too. Once we start to see a bias in a particular area, we see it more readily. And when we see it, we can then decide, well, do I allow that outlook, that attitude to continue working, or am I going to just take a pause and make another decision? Daniel Kahneman wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and he, in a sense, really introduced this idea of unconscious bias as fast thinking, where we make, those snap judgments.
Yeah.
And so what he was trying to say, which I think is so clear and helpful, is that, yes, we make these snap judgments. They're fueled by our biases, but the key to working with them is to, once we see them, is to stop and do some slow thinking. Just take some time, start investigating, take that proverbial step back, and then make a decision from there.
Excellent. I just want to, just salute you because this area is quite, a deep area, like I said earlier. And I'm just so thankful. If you're just joining us on Leadership Talk with Adegoke, I'm speaking alongside with my friend, Bron Williams. She's from Melbourne, Australia. It's 4 p.m., past 4 p.m. in Australia right now. And is where I am in Africa right now. It's past 6 a.m. So there's a time difference, but we're just showing up to add value. Now, I just want you to speak to this. In Australia, what's your experience regarding bias? in the workplace?
Okay. Well, there, Australia has an interesting history in terms of our national history because as a nation, we're quite young. You know, we became a nation at 1900, so 120 odd years ago. However, the peoples who've inhabited Australia have been here for 60,000 years. The Indigenous peoples, the First Nations people.
Okay.
And those, Australia was colonised by the British, and they introduced their ideas, and there was a lot of very terrible things. There were massacres, imprisonments, all sorts of things that the British did, that white people did to the First Nations people, to the Indigenous people. Now, that attitude still continues today, unfortunately, if not overtly, but subtly. And that sense of white privilege, of white superiority, which I know I have, I've had to come face to face with that and come to terms with that. But it comes out in assumptions that we make about people that, you know, and when I first started to understand, it was about assuming that as a person who was university educated, who came from a first world country, that I had better ideas than, say, the Nauruans did on their little Pacific island about running things. You know, it was this assumption because of, hello, white person, developed country, you know, university educated. Those are that's where bias shows up. But on a personal level, as a woman, I've experienced bias as well, where in, say, a workplace situation, your viewpoints are not taken as seriously as the men in the room.
Wow.
You know, so, yeah, it's often wherever there is a minority group, whether that's by gender or age or race, that then has difficulty having a voice.
Wow.
That's where the issues happen. And it would be as common, well, it's probably in many ways very, very common here in Australia. And we actually need to deal with it, and we're not doing very well at the moment.
Wow. Now, I just want to thank you for being authentic, you know, and speaking to that, going back to how Australia, you know, came about, you know, the founding fathers and all that, you know, and how that bias is still affecting, you know, the minorities in Australia, and not just, you know, I think it's just a pattern, you know, all over the world. Wherever you have the minorities, I mean, the majority will want to dominate, and you know, but how can we begin to address those biases, particularly on the personal level? For example, you reach out, you know, to me to come on this podcast, and obviously you must have been able to break that bias, because for some people, you know, I just don't want to be seen with, you know, someone of another race. It might affect my brand, you know. And am I really sure I want to do this? How were you able to overcome that? Because you can be speaking to you know, a particular issue, but you might not really. You might just be in it for the money or for the influence. You might not really. It might not really be you deep down. How were you able to engage and, you know, overcome that that bias? Yes.
I think the first thing is actually to be honest with yourself.
Yeah.
And I have to be honest with myself, that my own personal biases are always there, and they do get in the way at times, and I have to intentionally work against them.
Yeah.
I have a natural tendency as a white person to listen to other white peoples, to assume that other white people have the best ideas. And now that's come out of my upbringing. What I have to intentionally do is listen. That is such a key. Two of the key things for working with biases are ask questions and to listen, because I can make assumptions about you based on your nationality and your skin color. And I do that automatically. And I'm not saying I don't, okay? This is part of being human and authentic here.
Yeah.
I do make those judgments and assessments, but I don't want to allow those biases to be a barrier between you and me, or me learning something from you. So I have to listen, and not only listen but try to hear. And I'll give you an example. Last year when COVID struck and, we were trying to figure out how do we do our business now online, I did a series of YouTube conversations called Bringing Bias in from the Cold. And one of them was with a friend of mine who I've never met. We met over Facebook and we've got to know each other. And her name is Fusina. She lives in Accra, in Ghana. And she was one of my interviewees. And as we talked, she was expressing opinions that I did not agree with. But I had to consciously zip my lip because her outlook, her attitudes were based on how she was raised, the society in which she lives, the community that she mixes with. And I had to listen. And that was such a clear indicator to me that how easily our biases allow us to make assumptions about people. But if we listen, we can actually start to learn something.
Wow. Amazing. Wow. This is Leadership Talk with Adegoke. I have with me Bron Williams from Melbourne, Australia, and we're looking at leadership and bias. Bron is a bias specialist, and she's been adding powerful value. Thank you so much. Now, I want you to also to speak to what are the two things that you can say to someone out there that's going through a bias, could I call it a bias challenge? What are two things that you can say to that person to get by?
Okay. Well, I'll take it from two different points of view.
Okay.
If the bias challenge is your own, you're aware of your own biases and you're struggling because they keep coming up and you feel like they're getting in the way, just like I shared there about my own dealings with people from Africa.
Yeah.
The key thing is not to get discouraged, because when we find out something difficult about ourselves, our natural tendency is to want to get rid of it. Either ignore it or get rid of it. Now, ignoring it doesn't make it go away, and because we can't actually get rid of our biases, they're this automatic part of how we think.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we can get discouraged and think, am I ever going to get this right? Am I always going to think this way? So when you get discouraged or feel discouraged because your biases keep popping up, know that that's a good thing because you're aware of them. And once you're aware of them, you can actually work with them and be kind to yourself. We're going to fall back into our default ways of thinking. And if on the second thing, if you are coming up against biased attitudes towards you, and I was talking with a team of people and company just this morning about this, how to deal with other people's biases, particularly if the bias is towards you. And what I said is this is where we can be allies with one another. So in a workplace, if you're, I'll say like my friend Tara, who is Sri Lankan. Now, if she, as she has had to face at different times, racial slurs or comments, as her ally, I can stand up for her. I can challenge that. In the situation that the client this morning was talking about, she is an accomplished architect, but in the early days, clients would only talk to her partner, who was a man. But he was a good ally because he said to the client, Cass is the one who is in charge of this project. She's the one who's running. So he led the conversation, pointed back to her. So having an ally, someone you can call on in that situation, is really helpful, because it's so hard when we're having to face the bias on our own, because people are just, oh, you're just having a whinge, you know, you're whining, complaining.
Yeah.
It's not that. So
Just making it up.
Can be really, really helpful.
Wow. Awesome. Amazing. Wow. This has been awesome. This has been awesome. Deep dive. We're taking a deep dive. For those who are going to be watching the replay or listening, you know, we're just adding so much value through my friend. She's just, you know, breaking it down regarding bias. And now I just have two more questions. Now, professionally, how have you been able to use, you know, bias? You know, you're being a bias specialist. How have you been able to use it to impact the society? You want to give two examples or one?
Yeah, well, one that comes to mind is I'm working with a peak sporting body here in Australia, and they, because I had a relationship, an online relationship through LinkedIn with one of the people who worked there, they approached me about just exploring doing some unconscious bias training. Now, they were right at the beginning of this journey, and they said, look, we don't know what we don't know. Can you come and help us get started? Now, for me, that's a huge privilege, because I get to set the standard of things. So this is a big a national sporting body here in Australia who is now starting to see we've got to take this seriously. You know, we can see bias in sport, but we've got to see it how do we do it in relating to kids' sport or, you know, our staff situations. So that's what I'm doing. I'm working with them, doing some introductory webinars, helping them understand what bias is. Then we'll move through a program where they get to look at their own biases at an individual level. So it's going to be both sort of a corporate and then an individual. So that's so that's the sort of work that I do, because companies, corporations, businesses are starting to see that we need to look at bias, because it really impacts business, impacts relationships, and we can do better as human beings.
Wow. That's awesome. Finally, last question. If listeners want to reach you, how can they reach you?
Well, they can go to my website, which is bronwilliams.com, or they can email me at info@bronwilliams.com, or they can find me on Facebook. I'm Bron Williams, the bias specialist there.
Wow. Amazing. So you've heard it from the lady, Bron Williams, adding so much content on Leadership Talk with Adegoke. We've looked at leadership and bias, the 57th podcast of Leadership Talk with Adegoke. I'm just so thankful for the privilege to share the platform with you. This is the second time you've been on this platform before to share on leadership and burnout, and this session has been amazing. So thank you for coming. Have a great day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Well done. Thank you so much.